Today's video is part 3 in the 3-part series of suicide risk factors and protective factors. And now let me remind you again also that I've posted a handout which goes right along with these 3 videos. Each risk factor goes by the same number, whether it's in the video or in the handout. But in the handout I've also, which is called Questions for Suicide Risk Assessment, I've included examples of questions of what you might ask and how you might ask it to elicit a lot of this same material. Let me also mention that as we've talked about before, the risk assessment is a clinical judgment that you have to make, weighing the factors, weighing the risk factors on one hand and the protective factors on another, with the idea of what's the probability that this person is going to try to kill themselves in the next few hours or the next few days. We're not concerned about, at least not at this point, about lifetime suicide or anything like that. We're just looking at the short, immediate future. And that's what our focus needs to be in these kinds of mental health emergencies. So I want to then start with risk factor number 40, and I want to point out that these are certainly not in the order of importance. I've tried to group the various risk factors in consistent groupings that make some kind of sense logically, but that doesn't mean at all that they're in the order of importance. And a stressful life event is certainly not the 40th most important risk factor. In fact, no one knows what the most important risk factors are. Maybe the best evidence we have is let me go forward, is the study I showed before, which calculated for a large number of studies over the past 50 years, odds ratios of variables that were associated, in this case, with death by suicide. If you recall, the study also looked at suicide ideation, and separately suicide attempts, and then separately death by suicide. So we could use these as maybe a way to say what's the most important risk factors. That'd be one way to look at it. But let me go back, though, before we talk about that and just elaborate a little bit on the stressful life event. This is the same kind of stressful life events we talked about earlier in the semester. We can think about normative events like loss or threat of loss, some kind of violent situation, financial stress, relationship changes, things like that. And we can also, of course, think about traumatic stress. Life or death, threat of life or death, or great bodily harm, or sexual violation. So it's both those kind of events. This is exactly the same as we talked about earlier in the semester. But it's, I think, important to recognize that in the past, I would say 20 to 30 years, in the field of suicidology, the focus has been on mental illness, and there has been very little focus on stressful life events as being an important risk factor. It's beginning to change just recently, I'm happy to say, but the emphasis is still, I think, largely on mental illness. So in this study that we talked about before, you'll notice that prior psychiatric hospitalization, a person who has a prior psychiatric hospitalization has an odds ratio of 3.57. That means they're 3.5 times more likely to die by suicide than a similar person who doesn't have any prior psychiatric hospitalization. So hospitalization was at the top of the list with the odds ratio of 3.57. Fifth on the list was stressful life events with an odds ratio of 2.18. So you could say, maybe a prior psychiatric hospitalization is half again more important. But I'd also point out, though, that this is not simply, that the top one here, is not simply presence of mental illness, but it's prior psychiatric hospitalization, which means very severe mental illness. So if we want to compare mental illness in general and stressful life events, I think since mental illness in general is not even on the top 5, we can say that stressful life events has a higher odds ratio than simply mental illness does. So it goes, back and forth. As I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion of risk assessment, the conceptualization that most people believe is we start out with mental illness, then you have a stressful life event, and then you have a trigger state that the stressful life event knocks the person into a very fragile state where they become more likely to take action. So just as a few examples of stressful life events and how they relate to suicide, one study of survivors of gun attempts, and this is interesting because there aren't that many people that decide and then try to kill themselves with a gun who survive. But 64% of 33 subjects, well, 2/3, like 22, probably 21 or 22, said that their attempt was due to interpersonal conflict. A Texas study of 30 people who attempted suicide with guns, 60%, which would be 18, had an interpersonal conflict within a day before they attempted suicide. And a study in Sri Lanka found that half of 268 people who tried to kill themselves with poison had an argument with a family member or partner, and less than 30 minutes later attempted to kill themselves. So it gives you another picture about the impulsive attempts as well. But the main point here is it's common that when people make suicide attempts, there is a stressful life event in the immediate past, often involving important people in their lives. Another example of situational factors and a separate risk factor is anniversary reactions. And as social workers, I think we often talk about people having strong emotional reactions on the anniversary of a loss or a traumatic event, and typically the first year anniversary is the most intense. Another risk factor is contagion. That suicide is contagious. Suicide is catching in a small way. And we talk about contagion with sort of two different categories. One would be a local cluster, such as a student suicide in a high school or a middle school, and the other being contagion due to celebrity suicide. So with regard to the local cluster, the risk with one suicide, one kid that dies of suicide in a school, is the potential for others to do a similar thing. Now, it does happen. It's quite rare. It's not rare that there are rumors. There's always rumors. Anytime a young person dies of suicide in a community like a school, there are rumors that there are other kids waiting, to follow suit. They're going to show up at midnight at the cemetery in 3 days, and 2 other kids are going to die, things like that. So the rumors are ubiquitous. The actual occurrences are less, but it's not zero. It does happen. And if you recall my chapter on crisis intervention with traumatic events from earlier in the semester, I talked about how in a school, suicide really is the one traumatic event that's a little different from all others because of the potential for contagion, copycat deaths. And the way around that also I talked about in that chapter is the idea of how teenagers and young adults invariably see suicide in terms of a romantic tragedy. And so our job as school social workers is to undermine that view of a given suicide as being a romantic tragedy and play up the idea, and you have to do this with some finesse or you'll just alienate people, but to play up the idea of an alternative narrative. And that alternative narrative would be a kid who was having emotional problems, and when I did this I would typically use the word emotional problems, not mental illness. A kid who was having emotional problems and some event, some bad thing happened to them, and then they made a really bad decision after that. So it makes it less romantic and less likely that other kids are going to follow suit if they view the kid who died as someone who made a big mistake and who had emotional problems, things like that. You, in most cases, probably can't reveal confidential information, but you can always say, in most cases like this is what it's about. Okay. Now, contagion due to celebrity suicide is similar in that suicide can be catching, and often the highly publicized death of a celebrity, typically show business celebrity or politician, those are the major 2 categories, can lead to an increase in suicide nationally. Now, with the local cluster, the numbers are way too small to ever show a statistically significant difference. But if we look at the country as a whole, the United States as a whole, after a celebrity suicide, then the sample size obviously is huge, And we can find statistically significant increases in suicide after a celebrity suicide. There are also, which I put on the slide here, as a response to that, several organizations several suicide prevention organizations have published media guidelines to try to get TV, news, newspapers, social media, when they publicize or when they even report suicide of a celebrity, to try to do it in a certain way, which is to not to mention the method if possible, not to romanticize or glorify it, not to try to boil it down into one factor, because suicide is never just one factor, things like that. But unfortunately, those guidelines are rarely followed. To include a crisis line number for people who may need it. I've seen that more and more, though, lately. That one seems like that is happening. We don't know a lot about these kind of deaths. We don't have a good theory other than kind of a simple one, which is identification and imitation, which applies actually to both kinds of clusters. It's that the original student or the celebrity, that the other people identify with them, and once they've learned what they have done, then that identification leads to imitation, leads them to follow suit, to do the same thing. Now, this only happens with people who are already teetering on the edge. It doesn't mean that a famous person's suicide takes someone who has no thoughts of suicide and tips them over the edge, but rather it's people who are already quite ambivalent, who maybe are up around 52% I want to live, 48% I don't want to live, and then the death of a famous person that they identify with can tip that balance just a few points, but that's all it needs when they start out being way up on the scale of ambivalence already. After the suicide of a famous person, the at-risk time for other people tends to be about a month, and I mentioned it's people in politics and entertainment. But there have been many studies of celebrity contagion, over 100, and only 35% have found an increase in suicide among the general population afterwards. This is both in the US and in Europe. So 2/3 of the time it appears that there isn't any contagion among the general population, but 1/3 of the time there is. So, whoops, I turned the slide the wrong way. So here's a few examples. James Forrestal, Secretary of Defense, when he died of suicide in 1949, they were able to statistically control for trends in year by year, month by month, season. The suicide is highest in the spring and fall, and other variables in order to isolate the increased number of suicide. And again, there was an increased number of suicides, 55 additional suicides after Forrestal's death by suicide. Lester Hunt was a senator and killed himself in 1954, which led to 89 additional suicides. And one of the factors about this was that Hunt was apparently blackmailed about his son, who was gay. And at that time in the 1950s, this was enough evidence to cast Senator Hunt into a negative light. So we know that LGBTQ people have a tough time in the year 2020, but believe me, it was a lot worse in the year 1954, as evidenced by this situation. Marilyn Monroe died of suicide in 1962, which led to 197 additional suicides. The picture with her with Joe DiMaggio, her husband at the time. Kurt Cobain, in 1994, died of suicide. And it appears, surprisingly enough, that his suicide led to 0 additional suicides. Now, actually, I know a few cases that were reported in Seattle, where he lived, that appeared to be copycat deaths, but no statistically significant increase across the country, which is surprising, because you would think a young celebrity who was admired and idealized by a lot of people would lead to copycat suicides. Now, one reason maybe that didn't happen, is that in Seattle, 2 or 3 days after he died, not long at all, one of the Seattle radio stations decided to hold a memorial get-together in a city park where people who were fans of Kurt Cobain could get together and essentially grieve his death. I heard the story told at a conference of the American Association of Suicidology by a woman who was the director of the Crisis Center in Seattle. And she said, for one thing, the radio station expected maybe 500 people, and they got like 5,000 people or something like that. A huge crowd turned out. But the important, and people consoled each other and felt bad. But the important thing that happened was that they had a tape from Courtney Love, who was Kurt Cobain's wife, and they had a small child at the time. And on this tape, which was made, since Cobain's death, but before the rally in the park, so within a day or two, that Courtney Love performed a service to people and made, I think, what people look back on as a very important suicide preventative intervention. I don't think she did it on purpose, but she, on this tape made for this rally, talked about how much his suicide hurt her and how much it hurt their child and how harmful it was and what a cruel and terrible thing to do, what a selfish thing to do. And she ended up by kind of leading the crowd in a chant of "fuck you, Kurt, fuck you, Kurt, fuck you, Kurt." And it really showed people, I think, the harm and the devastation that follows a suicide to family members, if not other people as well. And that may have really, made a difference and led to fewer copycat deaths in Seattle as well as the rest of the country. Another example is Jin-Sil Choi, a South Korean actress who died of suicide in 2008, which in South Korea led to 429 additional suicides. Choi Jin-sil was a South Korean actress. She was considered one of the best actresses in South Korea, named the nation's actress. She played leading roles in 18 films and 20 television dramas, appeared in 140 commercials, and won the 33rd Grand Bell Award for Best Actress. So in South Korea, a major celebrity, and led to 429 additional suicides. But here's the one that takes the cake, unfortunately, is Robin Williams. It's been 6 years now since Robin Williams died of suicide in 2014, and his suicide has led to 1,841 additional suicides. The increase, as opposed to the usual 1 month, lasted for 4 months, from August to December 2014. There were 1,841 additional suicides. An equal increase among men and women. Biggest increase was in people between the ages of 30 and 44, and also a significant increase in the number of people who used hanging or suffocation, which is the method that Robin Williams used. Now, this might be different from some of those previous celebrity deaths because it's the first really highly publicized suicide in our age of 24-hour news coverage, information overload, social media, everything like that. There was a huge amount of publicity about his death, and I think it's important to note that he was very famous and he was very well liked. I think are major factors which led to these additional suicides. And here's a graph that shows that. I think you may have read that it's come out in more recent years that Robin Williams either suspected or was diagnosed with Lewy body dementia, dementia similar to Alzheimer's, loss of intellectual abilities, downhill slide of intellectual abilities due to Lewy bodies in the brain. And that now people are focusing his suicide not so much on depression or some of the usual factors, but this insidious slow onset of dementia. More recently, even still, we have Chris Cornell of Soundgarden in 2017. No studies that I know of yet that have found any additional increase in suicides. Chester Bennington, who was a friend of Chris Cornell, also died of suicide in 2017. Kate Spade in 2018. Anthony Bourdain in 2018. And Jeffrey Epstein in 2019. Of course, a lot of people think that he did not actually kill himself. So I don't know if we want to get into any more conspiracy theories, but I don't think we would see any copycat suicides because it's only on people who are viewed positively in the media. More recently, in 2019, Sully, South Korean K-pop singer, died of suicide. Actually, one of my clients, who is a young woman who is Chinese American, was a big fan of Sully, and she said when she was recently thinking about suicide that the fact that Sully had killed herself was a factor in her thoughts about suicide. So now all of these celebrity suicides, obviously we're talking about real live people. There have been a few studies in the past about fictional accounts of suicide. Actually, it starts out with The Sorrows of Young Werther, which is a novel written by Goethe in the 1800s, I believe, which really romanticized suicide due to lost love in one's youth. So sometimes these are called the Werther phenomenon, copycat suicides. But up until recently, there's never been any evidence that fictional suicides actually affected real people's lives, that they actually led to increased suicide. But now actually there have been two studies of 13 Reasons Why, which I'm sure you all remember from a couple years ago, a fictional account of a teenage girl who kills herself for a variety of reasons, apparently 13 different reasons, many of which involve being poorly treated by other people. And there have been now two studies, one by Niederkrotenthaler and colleagues, published in a prestigious journal, JAMA Psychiatry, which did a time series analysis, and they found that through 3 months there were 66 more suicides than would have been expected among males, and 37 more than would have been expected about females, all among teenagers. No increase in older people, but also an increase in hanging as well. A second study of 13 Reasons Why by Bridge et al. In another top flight journal, the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, found an increase among boys but not among girls, and that's partly because they used a different methodology. They also found no increase in any other age group, and they also looked for homicide and found no increase in homicide. So these two studies, while they disagree a little bit, one said it was teenage boys and girls. This one by Bridge said it was only among boys. Still, that's how science works. Get a few more studies and we'll begin to home in on, what is the actual phenomenon. But it is interesting if it caused an increase among teenage boys. Of course, boys do die of suicide more than girls by a 4-to-1 ratio. But at the same time, 13 Reasons Why was about a girl who killed herself. So you would think that people who felt identified in terms of copycat behavior, you'd think it would be girls more, but maybe not. Okay, other risk factors. Current use of drugs or alcohol. And by this, I don't mean having a drug or alcohol problem necessarily. We talked about that earlier with the different mental disorders that make a person vulnerable to suicide. But here we're just talking about people using drugs or alcohol as part of their suicide attempt. Get drunk and take an overdose. Get drunk and hang yourself. Get drunk and asphyxiate yourself in the car. In fact, 1/3 of all U.S. suicides have alcohol in their blood, some at a very high level. And this isn't necessarily that they died from alcohol poisoning, but it's that they got drunk in order to be able to basically quell their anxiety and be able to carry out whatever the suicide attempt was. But I have a similar example, a slightly different example of the role of alcohol and drugs, and that's with Jeff Alm, who was a football player for the Houston Oilers, but who grew up in a Chicago suburb, Orland Park, and he died of suicide in 1993. He was in Houston. One of his best friends, Sean Lynch, who still lived in Orland Park, like I said, a Chicago suburb, and Lynch went down to visit Alm in Houston. They went out partying, and had a car accident. Alm's driving, had a car accident, and as you can see on my slide, Alm's blood alcohol level was 0.14. Lynch's was 0.30. Unbelievable. Most of us would be unconscious even at Alm's level, and certainly unconscious at Lynch's. So this shows basically that these people were able to function as barely, was that they had developed tolerance, which does suggest an ongoing alcohol problem. But in any case, Alm was driving. He was in a part of Houston that he was not familiar with. Here's a picture of him. And he went up a curvy expressway ramp. This picture is a little hard to see. You can see there's the ramp with a couple of motorcycle cops up on the ramp, and then down below you can see there's a body lying in the grass and several other people who are police officers. That Alm hit the side of the expressway ramp at a high rate of speed, and Lynch, his friend, was in the passenger seat, was not wearing a seatbelt, and he was ejected through the front windshield, and not just down onto the pavement, but over the edge of the railing and 30 feet down to where you see his body right there. The car was stopped. Alm was not thrown out of the car. Maybe the steering wheel stopped, or maybe he was wearing a seatbelt. But in any case, he got out of the car, called the police on his cell phone, opened the trunk of his car and took out a loaded shotgun, shot the shotgun once in the air, and then killed himself with it. So actually one of the Houston Oilers coaches said that it seems that he tried himself, convicted himself, and executed himself. And that makes sense. But I would obviously point out that without the alcohol on board, they probably wouldn't have had the car accident. Without the alcohol on board, I don't think most people, at least, would have been devastated, but would not have killed themselves after an accident like this, even if we grant that the accident might have happened. So the role of alcohol on board. Another risk factor that we've talked about before is recent discharge from a psychiatric hospital. Now this is a fact, the statistics show it, but like many other risk factors like this, we don't know exactly why. As you know, my theory is about ambivalence, and that is that after an attempt, most people automatically have a shift in ambivalence, and they no longer feel suicidal. They can't understand why they did that. They can't believe what came over them, stuff like that. And if they go into a hospital, then the hospital staff is going to say, oh, well, a patient is no longer suicidal. And they might attribute it to their interactions or their therapy or their medication. And the patient keeps saying that he's not thinking about suicide anymore. And after a week or so, they discharge this no longer suicidal patient. Now, unfortunately, a lot of people who come out of psychiatric hospitals never get any kind of follow-up treatment. And so you could easily see why a month later, without any follow-up treatment, the only thing that changed was the ambivalence in the beginning, and then the ambivalence, since nothing has changed, slowly goes back and the person becomes suicidal again. Another explanation is simply some people didn't have adequate treatment, or that the treatment lowered their risk but only temporarily. But in any case, recent discharge from a psychiatric hospital is an important risk factor. And I think we saw that before, remember, with the study by Pokorny, which showed suicides after a hospitalization, and the highest number in the first month, the first couple months after hospitalization. Another important risk factor is, surprisingly maybe, taking antidepressant medication. You would think this would work the other way around, because antidepressants are supposed to treat depression and therefore help a person who with depression become less suicidal. And I think it probably does do that in a certain number of cases, but the risk is that in a small number of cases it makes people worse. And this was first looked at as long as maybe 15 years ago in an analysis, as I put on the slide here, by the FDA, which found in a study of 2,200 adolescents, half were taking SSRI antidepressants, and 4% of them had suicide ideation or suicide attempts, no completions. And in the other group, the placebo group, only 2%. So, you would think it would be the other way around, but it isn't. And there was a lot of work and speculation at the time about what is this. This phenomenon, by the way, led to what now we have, what they're called black box warnings on any antidepressant. If you read the package insert, there's a black box right at the top, and the black box has a special warning that you're supposed to pay special attention to, and it is this idea about increased risk of suicide. Only in a small proportion of people, as I put on the slide, it's thought to be in the ballpark of 2 to 4%, but there is that increased risk. And it appears to be due to akathisia, which I've put on the slide here. Akathisia, I think this is important because it's not well known, I think, by a lot of social workers. Akathisia is a medication side effect. It happens a lot with antipsychotic medications, but it happens with antidepressants as well. It's an inner restlessness, a very uncomfortable sort of inner agitation and restlessness. And people find themselves, pacing around and rocking in place, and this horrible feeling of restlessness, which on the one hand is tolerable if you know that it's a medication side effect, right? After all, that implies, and it is true, that if you stop taking the medication, then the side effect goes away. But unfortunately, a lot of people have developed akathisia and don't know that it's the medication. They think it's just them, that their depression has worsened, that their depression now includes this horrible, restless, agitated feeling that is very uncomfortable. And this apparently is what leads then to some people taking their own lives. And also there are some cases of especially middle-aged men, not just taking their own lives, but killing wives and families as well. So akathisia is important. You might say, well, don't doctors talk about side effects when they prescribe medication? And the answer is, sort of, right? One of the problems is that the more you tell someone about the possibility of a side effect, the more likely it is they'll have it. So I think some doctors kind of downplay it. They often do with antidepressants talk about how in the beginning some people feel a little bit sedated, some people feel a little bit activated, it goes away after a couple weeks. And at least some of them talk about the sexual side effects, because that's the single most important reason that people stop taking antidepressants. But a lot of them don't talk about akathisia. It is rare, but I think it's important. And so anyway, if you have a client who has recently begun taking antidepressants or recently had an increase in dose of antidepressants, then it would be, I think, important to talk about akathisia, watch for agitation and restlessness. I've even seen one report that suggested that you could get akathisia from reducing a dose of an antidepressant, but normally we're thinking about the first initiation of taking it or an increase in dose. Now there's other medication, actually many medications, that may have an impact on suicide that haven't been studied as closely, but I've listed a few of them here. Singulair, which is decongestant for allergies. Chantix to help keep people stop smoking. Accutane for acne. Reglan for stomach problems and reflux. All of these are associated with increased risk of suicide. Now finally, we have another group of factors that are really specifically relevant if you're interviewing someone right after they've made a suicide attempt. And the first one of these is to go over the attempt process step by step. What happened then? What happened then? So I've termed that review the chronology of the attempt. This corresponds to, in the Shea book, he talks about the behavioral incident approach. And again, the idea is to ask, and then what happened, and then what happened. Don't settle for a summary. You want to hear the details, the blow-by-blow details, if you want to call it that. And if you do that, you can see, number 47, their overall natural but temporary change in ambivalence. You can actually, in earlier stages of the narrative, you can see other choices that the person made, which reflects their own ambivalence. What method did they choose among all the methods that were available to them? Did they set it up so they would be rescued? Did they set it up so that they wouldn't be rescued? There's a variety of things that you can glean if you hear the details of how the person went about their attempt. And again, you should expect that in very, very often there's this natural shift in ambivalence afterwards that is temporary. it's more than a few days. It's often several weeks, but it's a temporary change in ambivalence. You can also and should also ask after someone has made an attempt, what was their intention? Did they want to die, or what was their intention when they took that overdose, or when they sat in the car and turned it on? And here's one example of a study by Jacobson of teenagers. What reasons did they give for trying to kill themselves? And you can see things like get relief from a terrible state of mind, to escape from an impossible situation, to die, only 26%, to make people understand how desperate I was, to make people feel sorry, to find out if someone really cared about me, lots of other reasons. So it's helpful if you're interviewing someone right after a suicide attempt to ask them about that. What was their intention? What did they think would happen? What did they want to happen? Also, what's their reaction to surviving? That's the shift in ambivalence we pretty much already talked about. What's their reaction to the fact that they made an attempt, right? So a lot of people could be very glad that they didn't succeed, very glad that they're alive, but they still could really identify and say, yeah, I can still understand where I was coming from when I did that. And of course, that's more of a risk factor than someone who says, I can't believe that I would even do that. What were the reactions of significant others? And remember the idea about homecoming, the negative or positive reactions of important people right away after. Previously, we talked about it right after a traumatic event. In this case, a traumatic event would be the suicide attempt itself. And then finally, what's the client's current thoughts in light of their attempt, in light of these factors about their attempt? How does that make them feel about suicide now? One final risk factor then in my list of 53, which is obviously too long, too many factors to try to look into with any given interview you're in, but the idea would be to pick and choose, which ones are the most important for each individual client that you interview. And so finally, this final one is the idea about that you can't connect. You're not able to form an alliance or make a connection with the person, or they just out and out reject your help, reject anybody's help. This obviously is a risk factor, and often it would imply that that person has difficulty connecting with other people as well. And as you recall, I think I mentioned maybe several times early on, any risk factor that has to do with connections with people, well, any factor that is about connections and belonging tends to be a protective factor. Any factor that's about disconnection or not belonging or alienation from people or separation from people is a risk factor. All right, so that's a third of 3 videos talking about the core of the suicide risk assessment. Again, looking at risk factors and protective factors. And in the next video, we'll be talking about interventions that can be used, effective and ineffective interventions. There's a number of those. So we'll talk about that next. Okay, I'll see you soon.